Hello there and welcome. Today we are going to talk about maybe my favorite topic, which is our pie chart framework and how we use this to break down and really understand what's lying underneath in functional neurologic disorders. And so I'm going to share some pictures. We're going to dive into a lot of research. I'm going to share our reference list that supports the pie chart framework in our newsletter this week. So if you're not already on our newsletter, join our newsletter. You can just comment on the recording of this or the post before this. If you comment newsletter, I'll send you the link and you can sign up and I'll put the references in there. But if you are a person with functional neurologic disorder, or if you're a clinician that works with people with functional neurologic disorder, this pie chart framework was created for you to decrease some of the confusion with all of the symptoms, the overwhelm, and also really direct you right where to start with assessment and treatment and really down the path of recovery. So I know I dove into all of that and I forgot to introduce myself. So my name is Julie Hirschberg. I am a neurologic physical therapist. I am the owner and founder of re+active Therapy and Wellness. In fact, it is going to be our 13th year anniversary coming up this week. And we've been working with people with functional neurologic disorders for all of those years. And it was brand new to me, brand new to many folks. This is not stuff that I learned in school. And over that course of time, working with our team, working with PT and OT and speech therapy and psychology, we developed this framework, and it's really based on the neuroscience in understanding what are the underlying issues in functional neurologic disorders. So I also want to say, hey, I would love your questions. And I realize a couple of folks sent me questions ahead of time, and I want to ensure that we get to those. So I'm going to see if I can pull them up here on my computer in front of me so that I can answer questions that were sent here. So, thank you. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for your interest in really understanding what's underlying functional neurologic disorders, what's underlying my symptoms, and want to understand so that I can get started, right? So let's bring in the pie chart, and I'm going to start with this one. So I have a few pie charts here. I just have to warn you. But this is the framework that really guides us in understanding a person based on their story. We collaborate together to create a pie chart and really get down to like, what are the biggest pieces of the pie? And what I want you to think of with this is that it can be changing too, right? So if we figure out one piece at one moment at a time, it can also shift. So let me introduce the pieces of the pie to you here. I'm going to start at the top. Motor controls at the top, the sensory system, psychosocial and cognitive components, lifestyle, autonomic, and physical limitations. And I want to give you a little bit of background of where we came up with this. And this actually started way back when I started re+active, and I was talking to a movement disorder neurologist colleague. His name is Dr. Alan Wu. He's at Northwestern now. And we were talking about common patients, and he was often making a pie chart with the patient of their diagnoses, of comorbid conditions, and what might be really influencing their movement. And so he and I were having these pie chart conversations all of the time. And so it was a way for us to communicate about what was happening for a patient. And then Dr. Allen was amazing. He and I really started using this with the patient. And we further started developing this, and this was alongside my colleagues at re+active, to really understand from the literature what we know that might be impacting a person with functional neurologic disorder. So in this first pie chart that I'm showing you, it says FND pathophysiology. What we did is we took the research, the neuroscience, the brain-based studies that we're looking at, like how do we understand what is happening in FND, and categorized it into these major categories. These major categories are those things that would influence brain and body function. So motor control. This was probably the first category that we really conceptualized, because as a physical therapist, we're looking a lot at movement. And what the literature tells us in terms of functional neurologic disorders, what can happen from a motor control standpoint is that we lose voluntary control. So that might be tremor or dystonia or weakness or functional gait disorder or functional dystonia is what I mean when I say dystonia. All of those have a component of motor control, which is our voluntary control of muscles. And the literature is pretty robust, looking at the neuroscience, the pathophysiology of this to show that a person's attentional focus can change the way they move. And a person with FND oftentimes has lost some of that automatic control of movement due to an intentional focus, often to their body, often to symptoms. So for example, a person with FND may find that their arm tremors more when they're watching their hand and they're trying to do a task. But they might be, if they're doing a very engaging dance or painting or something like that, that tremor might go away. It doesn't mean that the person is faking it or had faked it. It means there's a motor control disconnect. And now we actually also really understand what some of those network issues really are. This brings me to the first question that somebody asked. I hope I can pull it up here. Because somebody asked about the network dysfunction specifically in FND. And I think this is a really good question. And I'm trying to bring the exact question up for you here. I don't know if I can pull it up on my computer like I had hoped to. I know where it is on my phone, but I can't pull it up while I'm in this live. Well, it was a good question about the network dysfunction in FND. And we do understand that functional neurologic disorder is a network dysfunction. And by network dysfunction, we're really looking at how different parts of the brain are talking to each other. And what we know and understand is there are particular areas that seem to be involved, and these have been in repeated studies. The default mode network and the salience network, and the particular parts of the brain that are associated with those networks, those have come up again and again. These are big components of motor control. So the default mode network is the network in the brain that is really looking at like that internal attention and focus of control. And the salience network is what allows real automatic movements because it shifts to a goal-oriented focus. And there's a really interesting study in pediatrics that showed this increased activation of the default mode network like it was always on. And then one of our goals from a therapy standpoint is to help turn that off, which we do by activating the salience network, which is goal-oriented movement. That is motor control. So, when I hear all the time that people have been told they were crazy, that they were making it up, that it was all in their head, in terms of FND, and what that really is not made up, not voluntary, not faking it, but a motor control issue, particularly when it comes to movement. But that is only one piece. I will say, I think physical therapists generally do a pretty good job at understanding the motor control piece. That was a big part of my training as a physical therapist, as a neuro resident, and as I continued my career. I think we generally do a really good job at that. We also do a good job at physical limitations. So that's up the upper left, physical limitations. This is something, though, that I think sometimes when folks get an FND diagnosis, we ignore some of the physical pieces, and we should not, because there are things that have come up in the literature. And again, this particular pie chart completely based on the literature here. Prior physical injuries before the onset of FND, hypermobility having a higher correlation with FND, having a prior concussion or whiplash event, pain, so common with FND. We cannot ignore the physical impairments. We want to assess and treat those things. We also don't want to just treat those things. So that's a really big part of the pie chart framework, is that we are zooming out to look at the whole person all at the same time. What I frequently hear in folks with FND is they've address some of the physical impairments, maybe some of the motor control, maybe over here they went to neurooptometry, maybe they did some sensory pieces, but not all at the same time, not all together. And folks, the brain works together. It works in networks, it works in pieces, talking to each other, and we need to address all of those pieces together. Okay, so motor control, physical limitations, we got the top two pieces of the pie. Let's go to the sensory piece of the pie. And again, this is something that's come up more recently in the literature, that folks with FND may have impaired sensory processing. Meaning they're not taking in sensory information in a neurotypical way. And that can mean many different things. We need to assess them, right? So it could mean that their sensory integration is impaired, that their sensory processing is impaired in some way. And again, we can assess it and we can treat it. The third, so that's sensory in the blue with the little eye on there. The next thing below that is psychosocial or cognitive. And I hear this from a lot of people that I meet. Their cognitive symptoms are really disabling, whether that's brain fog, memory, executive functioning, decision making, and these are all really, they interact with the other components. They interact with the sensory and motor control components, and they deeply affect the way the person engages in life. This is important to not miss. Same with the psychosocial pieces. Just having FND, just having symptoms that seem to come out of nowhere, just having symptoms that have been really hard to get a diagnosis for, being dismissed by medical professionals, that alone is a huge cause of stress for people with FND, and can be really, really traumatic. I would say the medical trauma is very, very high in this population, and a very important reason to understand that and have psychosocial support in some way. The other thing that we can't ignore is that there is a percentage of people, now it used to be thought this was everybody with FND, but there is a percentage of people with FND that have a type that is related to trauma. This is the trauma subtype of FND. In this case, we cannot miss the psychosocial piece of the pie. We also should look at the other pieces of the pie. If the person's having a movement disorder, they also need the motor and sensory parts, not just psychosocial. So we're zooming out to focus on the whole person, not just one singular piece of the pie. Now, I will tell you, we have had, I'm thinking of a client that I was just talking to her mom this week, and there's a physical component of her FND that you don't want to miss. And I suggested that she might work with a specialist for that physical component and then come into our program, right? And work on all those pieces together. Now, of course, we also address those physical components, but they can be, you can do a piece at a time. you're going to get better faster with all of the pieces and really understanding what's your biggest piece of the pie. The next one here is lifestyle. So we do understand from the literature in FND that lifestyle can be hugely impacted by FND, and lifestyle impacts FND. This is things like fatigue and energy and pacing throughout the day. That's a very big one. Sleep is highly impacted in FND, and FND impacts sleep. Your normal daily rhythms, your purpose and activity in life. People with FND are highly impacted from a disability standpoint, and this really affects their lifestyle also. So very important piece for us to look at. One of the bottom part of that box is self-efficacy. This is a really important component when it comes to really understanding how a person might be able to regain control of their movements, and that is through building self-efficacy. And some of the literature has shown that self-efficacy and self-agency might be very low in people with FND, and we can build that through engagement in meaningful activities. This is a huge area for OT. Our OTs also, I would say, our OTs, PTs, psychologists, speech therapists, all of us really work on the whole piece of the pie, or all of the pieces of the pie, but I think this is a very big OT piece of the pie. And then lastly, the autonomic. So there is literature showing things like low heart rate variability in people with FND, impaired or increased resting heart rate, changes in breathing pattern, higher cortisol, increased startle responses, all of these part of the autonomic nervous system. This is something that we regularly screen and treat as part of a person's FND. So how do we use this? This is really where I wanted to talk a little bit about this, is when people apply to our program. So we have an online application, people apply, they actually fill out some questions that start to give us an idea of what this pie chart might look like. Then we do a consultation. I do a lot of the consultations for our folks with FND. I get to meet people and their families every single week, and thank you so much because I learned so much from you. And we go through their story, their symptoms, what has been happening for them, and we co-create this pie chart together. And so I think I have another one here to share with you. So this is the subjective. So same pieces of the pie, but these are the things that I'm listening for and the person is telling me in their story. And we start to go, wow, the sensory piece of your pie is really big. Or, wow, it's the autonomic piece of your pie is really big. We need to start there. We need to start with those two, because by the way, there's like all these like crazy lines connecting all these pieces of the pie because they interact and interconnect a lot because our brain is not separated into pieces. Like all of these things are connected very closely. But what we do is we really discover together, what are those biggest pieces of the pie? What does the person need to really address them? Can they address those things through physical therapy, occupational therapy, psychology, speech therapy, and so on? And what do they need, right? What does the person need? And in our online FND membership, we have people really go through and self-identify. What is my biggest piece of the pie? And how can I, what strategies do I need? What assessments might I need? And then what strategies and tools do I need to help with that system? Many people have never had their sensory system assessed or their autonomic nervous system assessed, and maybe not together, right? So that's often a missing piece for people, is that they didn't have those pieces together. So I think it's very, very important. Then once we understand that, we start building a treatment plan. Here's our treatment pie. And this really, then we can hone in on what are the biggest pieces that are impacted for a person. And when I say impacted, it's really like what's underlying their symptoms. Like, we want to not just mask the symptoms. We don't want to put a Band-Aid on it. We want to fully understand why those symptoms are happening. The pie chart helps us get to that. So we can take that right into treatment. So I'm going to bring in a different pie here because this is very, very important. So we talked about those underlying kind of roots of FND. I want to come into another pie chart now. And that is, I've never met a person with FND that only has FND. That's not really unusual for most humans to have more than one thing. They might have FND and migraine. They might have FND and an ankle sprain. But these three here are probably the most common co-occurring conditions that I see. FND, POTS, and a hypermobility spectrum disorder. It might be Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So I give you this example of the diagnostic pie chart because this is, I think, the beauty of looking at the whole person is that we can look at where do these diagnoses intersect, how do they impact the person, and we can zoom out again to the whole person. I showed you the FND pie chart. We've got pie charts for zebra conditions. We've got a pie chart for POTS. We've got a pie chart for dystonia. We've got a pie chart for Parkinson's, because there are unique things to those conditions, but also where they overlap, there's a lot of important pieces. Where these three overlap highly is in the autonomic nervous system and the sensory system. And so what you see here is a particular person's case where we can then go, okay, these particular symptoms you're having, this is your FND. These symptoms that you're having are your hypermobility, and these symptoms that you're having are your POTS. Now, your sensory system that is affected by your hypermobility, meaning you're not getting great proprioceptive feedback from your body, that can directly start to cause functional dystonia, functional tremor, because your brain is getting really poor feedback from your body. So we find the ways that those might be interacting. And then if we support that person with hypermobility, if we support their sensory system, they actually, their FND symptoms often really decrease as well. Similarly with POTS, certainly a person with POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardic syndrome, may experience a tremor because they're trying to get blood flow to their brain. That's not a functional tremor in the presence of POTS. However, if that tremor persists, if that tremor it starts becoming in places that are not associated with their POTS and blood flow, that is a functional neurologic disorder. That's a functional tremor. And we're going to try to unpack, how did the brain and body learn that and why? But hands down, if we help somebody really support and manage their POTS, they can get a whole lot better, not only with that, but also in their functional neurologic disorder. So I wanted to bring up this other pie chart just to zoom out even more, that while we might be looking at that sensory, the autonomic, the motor control, the lifestyle, the psychosocial, the physical impairments in FND, we also want to zoom out and screen for comorbid conditions. So I didn't want to lose that for you. So I'm going to stop sharing here and I'm going to see if this is possible. My video might pause for a second, but okay, I think we are back, but I was trying to pull up the questions that folks have. And by the way, if you have questions, please send them my way. I think that I should be able to see them live here. And I think for some reason, I'm not able to pull up the questions that were already sent. But I paused there for a second to pull up the screenshot that I had, which said, if FND is a wiring question or a wiring network issue, why does my nervous system feel so sensitive, like it's 10 times on? And this was such a great question, just a brilliant question, and so common. I just want to say it's so common. And that sensitivity that you are experiencing is often due to the network wiring issue. And remember when I talked earlier about the default mode network and the salience network. If your default mode network is constantly on, it is ramping up some of the impulses coming into the body. That is going to feel like a very super sensitive nervous system, sensitive to sound, smell, taste, light, touch, you name it. We see that commonly. So that might be the wiring issue. And that has been shown to be common in FND. We need to address and deactivate. Now, I'm not saying like get rid of the default mode network. We still need it. We just need it in balance with other things for sure. Now, there's other possibilities there too. So for example, some of the things that we see in the literature in folks with FND is a higher prevalence of autism or ADHD. We also know that these special neurospicy brains also take in sensory information different than your neurotypical person. And those differences in sensory processing and sensory integration also can make for a very sensitive, very perceptive nervous system. Not an inherently bad thing. We're not going to try to change that. But I'm guessing from this person's question that theirs is ramped up even more, right? And that's so common in FND. And this also, so let's say sensory processing and sensory integration, that is just part of your neurospicy brain, but ramped up even more, very likely due to an attentional focus. The default mode network, I almost think of these things as a balance, the default mode network and salience network. And what we want to try to do is decrease some of that activation of the default mode network and increase some of the activation of the salience network. There's so many ways to do this, and it's very person specific. But I'll tell you one, if you were trying to activate my salience network, we would start like singing and dancing. And those things bring my attentional focus away from my body and into just like listening to the music and following the vibe, right? So that would be one way for me, you'd activate the salience network. The same thing for like my husband would not activate his salience network. So it's very different for each person. So that was a beautiful question. Another question that somebody had asked was in relation to FND and adaptive sports. And I believe the question was actually like, should people with FND be restricted from adaptive sports? And I would say like, hell no, like absolutely not. The person with FND who's maybe requires assistive device, is in a wheelchair, we want them to be participating in life. And if they can do that in a wheelchair, whether that's temporary or not for them, they absolutely should. I mean, let's talk about the default mode and salience network. If we are saying, no, you should not use an assistive device in wheelchair and not do something super fun like an adaptive support adaptive sport, we're actually telling somebody to kind of hang out here in their default mode network and not engage their salience network. So I actually think it would be like anti-helpful to dissuade somebody from doing those things. And this is part of the myths in functional neurologic disorders. It's actually where we as physical therapists sometimes get kind of weird. But it's because we were taught these things. So I'm not faulting you, PTs. I also went to school like 25 years ago and learned some of these same things. But it's a myth. Folks with FND are entitled and should have assisted devices and do adaptive sports if that is appropriate for them. And they might also be able to not use assistive devices. Again, I have many folks that I work with that are like, I'm in a wheelchair now and I want to be here. But I'm also okay to have a wheelchair so that I can go get ice cream, so that I can do these things. And I want people to do things. I want people to engage in life. And if their goal is to not walk, but to engage in life in their wheelchair, beautiful. Let's make it happen. Because this is centered on humans as people and persons. They're not faking it. They're not malingering. They're not doing this for attention. This is their body isn't working according to plan. Now, is it repairable? Absolutely it is. Does it happen in the same time frame for everybody? No. Do people often have comorbid conditions that also require devices? Yes. None of those are any valid reason to say a person shouldn't have an assistive device or participate in an adapted sport. So, but I will say, having taught our courses over and over again, this question comes up a lot. It's a very hot topic. In fact, some hospitals actually have processes or policies in place to not provide equipment to people with FND. And I'm just going to say it out loud. I think that's wrong. I think you're denying. Wow. That one's like making me choke. I'm having such a hard time with that policy. I actually woke up with just a little bit of like a cold or allergies today. And I think it just got to me. But maybe I'm super fired up about this topic. But I think that's just wrong. I think it's wrong to have a policy to deny people with functional neurologic disorders equipment. I'm sorry, I'm not crying over this, but my throat is really bothering me here. So, to that question, we should not deny folks equipment. We should not deny them access to adaptive sports. And we should respond to the person in front of us. What do they want? What do they need? What are they desiring in their life? And how can we help them get there in the most maximal way possible? So thank you for those beautiful questions. Thank you for joining me to talk about the pie chart. Again, this is the framework that we use in our treatment. Treatment for FND, people get better with FND. People get a whole lot better and they get back to life. And I really, truly believe the best way to do that is to look at the whole person. Using the pie chart gives us a framework to do it. It gives us a simple way to break down what's happening in the brain and body, and a way to know where to start, like which piece of the pie or which few pieces of the pie we should start with. So as a clinician, it greatly helps. But as a person with FND, it greatly helps in understanding what is actually happening. So thank you so much for joining me for our pie chart talk today. I'm going to include this recording in our newsletter. I'm going to include a reference list for that pathophysiology piece so you can see where that was made, where that came from. If you're not already on our newsletter, if you are a patient, go to reactivept.com. If you are a clinician, go to reactiveeducation.com. We have a very popular newsletter. It goes out every single week. I'll be writing it tomorrow, and I'll put all of this in there. So, hi Trina, thanks for coming as usual. It's so good to have you here. And if you are a person, by the way, with FND, that you're like, I would love to know my pie chart. Like, I would love a treatment that's looking at the whole person all together. You can apply to our programs. You simply go to reactivept.com, hit apply now. You can apply. We review your application. If you look like a person that would benefit from this approach, we set up a free consultation. It's often with me or another physical therapist. We create that pie chart together and really put together a plan for you and for your therapy. So you can check that out at reactivept.com. And I just want to thank you so much. Thanks for being here, and have a good night.